This is the
Five Stars
podcast.
Let me talk to you.
Hi.
So, what do you guys want to talk about? Tell me we're not telling lies.
Thanks, guys. Back to you.
Man, I hate starting shows on dour notes like this. I had this whole big monologue planned for a cold open. Small stuff to talk about to break the ice. Unfortunately, there's a pretty big wrestling news bulletin that hit over the last few days. And I'm sure most of you have heard by now about the passing of Loverboy Dennis Condrey. I believe it was announced on Friday evening. That's when I first learned about it. I was actually right in the middle of watching the WrestleMania 13 pay-per-view when I saw a couple news articles pop up in my feed. And this is the point where everybody starts getting on the internet and doing their little tribute videos, talking about Dennis's career. As of this point, Jim Cornette has not gone public with anything yet on his YouTube channel. I know for a fact that one's going to hit hard. To this day, I still haven't been able to bring myself to watch the Bobby Eaton tribute podcast he did. God, that was what? 5-6 years ago now? Can't believe it's been that long. If you know anything about my channel personally, especially having followed along in the retro review series over the last several years, go back and look at the timeline, man. Dennis was a huge instrumental part to everything we've covered. Whether we're talking NWA TBS syndicated Saturday Night Wrestling from 85 to 87, Midsouth from 84, World Class Championship Wrestling in 85. It's kind of hard to believe we've covered so much of Dennis's career in the last few years just going back and doing this retro series. And of course, I haven't gotten to touch anything he ever did in Memphis or the AWA. A lot of that footage is still out there. And it is stuff that I've gone back and watched and perused over the years. Especially during COVID times when I spent the majority of my evenings binge watching anything I could get access to on the network. And I would love to sit here and do a whole hour podcast talking about Dennis, but unfortunately, I just don't have the time for that in my schedule. And I don't want to take up too much time talking about the legacy of Dennis or his contributions to the wrestling business. I'll just say, his resume speaks for himself, especially if you know anything about wrestling history. I've talked plenty about how the Midnight Express is my all-time favorite group/tag team. It's not even really fair to call them a traditional tag team because, even when Stan came to replace Dennis in 87, you still had Jim Cornette as a pivotal member of the group. Whether it was Bobby, Stan, and Jim, or Bobby, Dennis, and Jim, they were a three-man crew. Even though Cornette was the manager and only wrestled sparingly, he was still an important part to the whole package. But I figured might as well take a minute to talk about how important Dennis was to the business. And this isn't just me glossing him up now that he's gone. For the people that haven't seen a lot of the territory footage with him, it's hard, especially for younger fans, I think, to truly understand just how impeccable he was as a talent. When you watch a Dennis Condrey match, be it a singles match or anything he ever did in a tag team environment, he really was a master at everything. His athletic ability, his timing, his facials, his ring awareness, his understanding of what his role was in any given situation. He got the business. Just like Bobby Eaton was, Dennis was a natural. It was a natural, God-given ability that you can't really teach outside the basics. A lot of people forget too, especially if you go back and look at a lot of his earlier work. We didn't really see Dennis do a lot of promo work in places like Midsouth, Dallas, or even in the Carolinas, mainly because by that point he had Jim Cornette as a mouthpiece, so he never had to do promos all that frequently. But Dennis could talk too. He could cut a hell of a promo. Some of the stuff he did in Memphis in 80, 81, 82, Dennis Condrey promos are pretty good. And again, think of all the different regions and all the different territories he worked throughout his career. Crockett, Mid-South, World Class, Memphis, the AWA, Florida. He was all over the place. I'm sure I'm missing a handful of other stuff, especially the stuff he did post-retirement or post-semi-retirement. But yeah, Dennis wrestled everywhere. And you think about some of the great talent he got to work with over the years. Fargo's, the Gibson brothers, Dundee, Lawler, Mantell, the Rock and Roll Express, Mr. Wrestling 2, Magnum TA, the Fantastics, Dusty, the Road Warriors. Jesus Christ, I could go on for hours. Dennis was alive and well during one of the greatest periods to be a wrestling fan, dude. And that's not hyperbole. That is a stated fact. And it's one of those unfortunate deals where I don't think he ever gets the credit he truly deserves, just because of the fact that he was a part of that same crew along with guys like Flair and Sting and Luger and Dusty. The list goes on. I mean, he's never mentioned among the all-time greats if you judge him solely based on name power. Now, if you look at drawing power, him, Cornette, and Eaton were responsible for helping to draw one of the biggest box office successes of the Midnight Rock and Roll program during the summer of '86 in the NWA. And they did record business across numerous towns for several months during the Bash Tour. So you can't say that Dennis didn't draw. Now, was he ever going to be a singles world champion for a major promotion? No. Was he ever going to reach the same level of success as guys like Flair or Dusty? No. But Dennis Condrey left a bigger legacy and bigger mark on the wrestling industry than I think a lot of people are willing to credit him for. And again, not to harp on younger fans, but I just don't think they had the capacity to get it. They never will. I mean, I was barely alive when Dennis was still wrestling full-time. By the time I really started getting into wrestling as a kid, Dennis had already been semi-retired anyway. So even I, unfortunately, missed the majority of peak Dennis Condrey. That wasn't until I went back and watched him on old videotapes and network footage over the years. But I just wanted to take a few minutes to talk about him because, especially for somebody like me, someone that still loves the Midnight Express and is one of the sole reasons that I'm still a wrestling fan to this day. When you lose those key critical figures in the business that made you a fan growing up, that shit hurts. It also makes you feel old. And I know for a lot of people, Hulk Hogan's death was a big deal. If you were a Hulkamaniac growing up, I can understand why something like that would kill your passion for wrestling altogether. You're losing a childhood hero, so to speak. Dennis, for me, is one of those childhood heroes. Does he rank among my all-time favorite 5 wrestlers? Maybe not top 5. Certainly top 10, easily. You know, it's Taker, Flair, Dusty, Cornette, Eden. Throwing guys like Angle, Sting, Arn, the Road Warriors, Stan Lane as well. Can't forget about him. And I think Dennis would definitely be in that running as well. A 100% bona fide Hall of Fame worthy talent. Not even a question in my book. And I know for a fact that I'll be cherishing my Midnight Express box set that much more. It's sitting front and center in my living room, top shelf, in its unopened, undamaged package, with all 4 key members of that group: Bobby, Dennis, Stan, and Cornette. It's one of the first things I see when I walk into my apartment, and every day I look at that thing, it reminds me of why pro wrestling is still cool to me. You know, it's guys like that that made wrestling fun. And even to this day, man, as bad as the profession has become, and as much as everybody's made a mockery of it throughout the years, you know, I can still look at that Midnight Express box set and smile occasionally. Same with all my books. I think there's always going to be that spark no matter what. Wrestling may be dead for a lot of jaded fans my age that grew up watching the classics and appreciating just how amazing the business used to be. And I completely understand that black pill mentality, because you look at the product today and it is a shell of what it used to be. But then I go back and watch a Dennis Condrey Bobby Eaton tag match, and I'm reminded, nah, man, pro wrestling is still cool as fuck. So let's get into the reviews. We're back for another round of the Saturday night TBS Superstation program. This week they were at the Cobb County Civic Center in Marietta, Georgia, which is a much more promising wrestling town than Altoona, Pennsylvania. At least there's some rich history with WCW running Marietta, Georgia for more than just spot shows. They said the runtime for the thing was 2 hours, although the runtime on the YouTube video was 1 hour and 3 minutes. So they either had 5-minute commercial breaks spread throughout the program, or they just cut a bunch of material from hour 2. Either way, I'm not going to complain. 1 hour of generic squash matches and boring green screen promos is much more tolerable than 2 hours of that. So I'll take it. As JR and Cornette were running down the format for the program, Corny kept drawing attention to the fact that Pillman and Zink were not scheduled to appear. Obviously, crediting that to the Midnight Express beating up Pillman with the tennis racket the other week. So that was one of those low-hanging fruit stories they dangled over everybody throughout the program. Try to give the syndicated show something for people to want to stick around for. We open this week with the Wild Samoans taking on Eddie Gilbert and Tommy Rich. I assure you this did not entice people to want to stick around to watch the remainder of the syndicated program. Partially kidding. By the way, they were referred to as the New Wild Samoans. Why? I guess because Samu officially left the team, so now it was only Fatu and the Samoan Savage. They also lost Humperdinck, which I didn't even think about that until now. He's been gone for a while. By that same token, hasn't Samu been gone for a while too? Or am I tripping? I honestly can't remember. And I'm the one doing the fucking retro review series. Can't keep track of who's around and who's gone. It's all a hot mess. But they had a reasonably fine TV match. This might have been one of the only times in his career where Eddie wrestled in short trunks. He also dyed his hair and cut it short. So he literally looked like every generic short-haired job guy we've seen on the Superstation program in the last how many years. The Samoans got heat on Eddie through the commercial, which led to Tommy Rich making a short babyface comeback. The crowd did come up for that. And right as Rich had one of the Samoans in a pinning predicament, the other Samoan came off the top with a flying headbutt to help score the 3. It's funny how they're still putting over the Samoans, despite that they're about to leave the company in less than a year. And that was followed with a quick Doom pre-tape, where they hyped up the match between Ron Simmons and Road Warrior Animal for later on. What they billed as a captain's match, which normally would come with the caveat that they're about to build to something involving war games. I mean, a captain's match was typically done to determine who gets the man advantage. But no, I'm pretty sure this was just labeled a regular one-on-one match with no added steps. They just called it a captain's match for whatever reason. So then we had Robbie Idol and Pat Rose versus the Minnesota Wrecking Crew number 2. Yes, you heard that right. They decided that in the year 1990, they were going to try to carry on the legacy of the original Minnesota Wrecking Crew by taking Wayne Bloom and Mike Enos and putting them under masks and calling them the Minnesota Wrecking Crew 2. 2 generic masked guys of the same height and same build. Because that was evidently going to get him over. Now, if I'm not mistaken, I believe this is only a temporary thing. I forget what the deal was, but I'm pretty sure Arn was injured around this time or something. So while Ole was still there, they had him serve as a temporary manager for Bloom and Enos. That way they could still carry on the feud with the Steiner brothers. I'm pretty sure it's all just building to a one-and-done blow-off where the Steiners beat these guys and they move on. I forget how long Arn was out for. By the way, I did find out the masked skyscraper that filled in for Spivey in that Wrestle War match against the Road Warriors, that was Mike Enos. Fun fact. Now, with all this in mind, Ole and Arn Anderson, Mike Enos and Wayne Bloom were not. They were not capable of filling the shoes of the original Minnesota Wrecking Crew. But they had to try to establish them for what they were intending to do with continuing the Anderson versus Steiner feud. I still don't get the purpose of the hoods. Like, did they think that Bloom and Enos looked too generic without them? That the people wouldn't take them seriously unless they had the hoods on? We did have a great spot here where Enos went to pick up Rose onto his shoulder, and he was going to try to run him into the corner to set him up in the Tree of Woe position. But the ref was standing right where Enos was trying to go. So you hear him yell out, "Get out of the way!" I laughed. Then they won with some type of wacky submission hold. I don't even know what it was. And that led to Ole doing the promo to try to get his new team over, which he did an admirable job at. Meaning that it was a decent promo, but nobody still actually ever bought that these two stood a chance in hell of actually beating the Steiners for the belts. The highlight of the promo was when he tried to compare collegiate wrestling to professional wrestling. His conclusion was, collegiate wrestlers try and do everything fair and square, but there's no place for fairness in pro wrestling. It is a win-at-all-costs game. And that is precisely why the Minnesota Wrecking Crew are going to be the new tag team champions. Yes, you see, because they're going to cheat and play dirty. Now that is a great fucking coach right there. I'll take Coach Ole any day of the week. Remember, boys, it's not about playing by the rules. It's about doing everything you have to in order to win. And if that means lying, cheating, and stealing, then that's what you do. That was a terrible Ole impression. But you know he's right. That is a man that wants to see you succeed. When he tells you to win at all costs. So then we had a Mike Rotunda and Norman promo that was so ungodly horrible I couldn't even bear myself to watch it and write anything down. Norman was wearing a goofy mask. They mentioned something about a secret box. And if it's not Patrick's secret shoebox with a drawstring in it, it's not worth caring about. Also not worth caring about was Captain Mike versus Ned Brady. This match blew anal shards. And meanwhile, Cornette at one point had the balls to insinuate that TBS should have been charging people to watch this show, considering the big card they announced. During this fucking match, Cornette actually said that out loud. He had so much heat with me by the end of this show. So while this incredibly horrible match was going on, Norman was on the floor in the Ninja Turtle mask looking like an absolute buffoon. They kept drawing attention to the giant black box at ringside. Which, by the way, they never explained how it got out there. It was just at ringside. Presumably, Norman wheeled it out. See, the sad thing is, I actually remember what the big reveal is when they finally unveil who was in the box. Trust me when I tell you, it sucked. Mike finally won with an airplane spin. Worst segment of 1990 so far. This was horse shit. Then we had the Road Warriors putting over the captain's match for later on. Only thing I took away from it was Hawk telling Ron Simmons that he'd be better off pumping gas or sweeping up floors instead of being in the ring with the Legion of Doom. At least in those professions, they can guarantee their health insurance deductibles won't be high. I love the idea that Hawk has a good grasp on the health insurance industry. We then had Paul Drake versus Cactus Jack. Kevin Sullivan was at ringside in Cactus's corner. They are aligned for reasons that I don't remember. By the way, can someone explain why the hell Kevin Sullivan was wearing a kitchen apron at ringside? What was going on there? It made Norman's Ninja Turtle mask look normal by comparison. It's so hilarious when I go back and see all this subtle material from WCW that I totally wipe from memory. You know, it's like, I knew how bad things were in the company around this time, but it's all these small nuances that I'm seeing again for the first time in forever and thinking, why is any of this shit happening? Why are Mike Rotunda and Norman the Lunatic friends? Why is Kevin Sullivan standing out there in a kitchen apron managing Cactus Jack? It's just... I don't know. Like, at this rate, I'm well beyond the point of giving a fuck. We're already skidding down the icy road in neutral. May as well just enjoy the train wreck as it unfolds. Don't try to make sense of it. Cactus beat up Drake for several minutes. I believe I counted 3 Russian leg sweeps during the match, none of which were the actual finish. But he did end up pinning Drake with a reverse Russian leg sweep, because that apparently hurt more. It was just Jeff Jarrett's old finish. Whatever he called it. The stroke. I almost had a goddamn stroke watching this terrible show. Oh, and staying on the topic of Mr. Sullivan, good news. He informed us that the issues between him and Norman the Lunatic are not over. Oh, ain't that just fucking grand? There's a match I need to see again. Kevin Sullivan versus Norman the Lunatic. After their Falls Count Anywhere fiasco with all the terrible bathroom humor. I don't even know what the hell he said in this promo, other than telling Norman that he doesn't care who or what's in the box, because nothing scares him. He also name-dropped Buzz Sawyer, who, yeah, apparently he's still there. I forgot about Buzz. They've been paying him jack all of nothing since the JTEX Corporation stuff fizzled out. I gotta go back and look at the roster around this time and see how many guys are just sitting on the sidelines getting paid to do nothing. The Iron Sheik was still around, right? That was like one of the biggest ribs during this time. The fact that they let his contract roll over and forgot that he was still under contract. So they just paid him for another year to sit at home and do nothing. Is it any wonder this company eventually went out of business? At least, if anything, we got a good Ric Flair pre-tape on this show. Now, granted, I didn't pay attention to the majority of what he said because, well, I couldn't stop staring at Nancy the whole time. How could you not? It took me until midway through the verbiage to realize that he was talking about Lex Luger. Like when he finally brought up the Wrestle War pay-per-view, I was like, oh yeah, he must be talking about Luger. He basically called him out and said that he can gripe about the situation all he wants, but until he beats Flair in the middle of the ring for the belt, nothing else matters. He can make all the excuses he wants, but the fact remains that he's still the world champion. And he basically put himself and woman over as the hottest thing in pro wrestling today. I swear, dude, I could watch an entire 2-hour syndicated show of nothing but Ric Flair and woman pre-tapes. I don't even care. Just put the both of them on camera and let them cook. Guaranteed it'll be far better than the majority of the bullshit we're getting on the show every week anyway. It was miles better than Luger's promo about Flairitis. I kid you not, that was an actual thing that Lex Luger addressed on nationwide cable TV. He said there's a disease in the NWA known as Flairitis, and that the only cure for it is his giant biceps. He really is lucky that he had $1 million body. Because if anybody else on that roster tried to say the phrase Flairitis with a straight face, and they didn't look like Luger, they'd have been laughed out of the fucking building. He said the diamonds are forever, but Ric Flair's title reign is not. Then he made bird hands at the camera before leaving. Yeah, Ric Flair's promo was a lot better. So we end up coming to the Ron Simmons Road Warrior Animal Captains match. Conspicuous by his absence here was Teddy Long. It probably would have been a more effective cliffhanger if Cornette didn't spend the entire match drawing attention to the fact that Teddy was not out there. It was like, tell me Teddy Long was going to eventually come out without telling me Teddy was eventually going to come out and cause chicanery. So in going over some of the highs and lows here, I like the early stages here where Animal was dominating Simmons. So in an effort to hype up Simmons, Butch Reed was out on the floor screaming "power" to the top of his lungs. That is how he suggested that Doom are the superior tag team. The fact that they had power and strength, even though Ron was getting his ass kicked. That is good heel logic. We've talked about how the Road Warriors are best used when they're basically the ones controlling the pace of the match, that they're not having to sell or feed for long stretches of time. Here, Animal pretty much mopped the floor with Simmons until Butch Reed tripped them up for the DQ. And that's what led to the afterbirth where the boys are fighting on the floor. And while Paul Ellering's in the ring, Teddy runs out and cold cocks him from behind with a loaded boxing glove. If anything, you have to go out of your way to watch the visual of Teddy when he ran from the back for this angle. It was like Scooby-Doo levels of cartoon hilarity. The way he snuck into the ring, hit Paul over the back of the head with the thing, and then ran out. It was comically over the top. Kind of a shame the match is so short before all the post-match material. Not that we needed to see a 15-minute back-and-forth slobber knocker. But the match, I think, only went like 4 minutes before the DQ. I will concede, one thing that I don't like about this feud, and this is probably nitpicky, but it's something that stands out to me. It's the fact that the issues in this feud seem to be stemming more from the heat between the managers than the actual talent. It's that they're trying too hard to make Teddy one of the main focal points in this feud. And while some people will try and argue, well, I mean, isn't that what they primarily did in the Midnight Rock and Roll feud? Okay, first of all, Teddy Long was not Jim Cornette. Let's establish that from the jump. And secondly, while yes, Cornette was trivial in being the heat magnet to keep the feud going, they were still presenting the main feud as the Midnights versus the Rock and Roll for tag team superiority. Like, you still had the understanding that the feud was about the actual tag teams. It just seems like they're doing more to build up a feud between Ellering and Long. And that Doom and the Road Warriors are just background bit players in the whole thing. I don't know. Just something I've noticed. And so that took us to Greensboro for a Wrestle War clip feature. Briefly to highlight Sting's appearance. He was still on crutches at the time. No face paint. He looked very glum. I mean, we were literally witnessing Steve Borden live and in living color. And that was his first appearance since the ACL tear in February. And so when we came back to Marietta, Sting was out for an interview with JR. No longer on the crutches. Face painted up for the big occasion. Still going through the rehabilitation process. But he came out to tell the fans that it's good to be back. And as he's going through the training of getting healthy and getting back in his groove, the one thing that Flair keeps harping on is that Sting won't ever be the same when he comes back. To which the Stinger says, "That's right, Rick. I won't be the same when I come back. When I come back, I'm going to be stronger, faster, and a whole lot madder than I am right now." And he, well, as JR noted here, he's still the Stinger. That he is, Jim. That he is. There was no one else like him. You know, kind of like how he mentioned that Luger was the only guy that could get away with saying things like Flairitis. Sting was the only one that could pull off a lot of these wacky, cartoonish babyface lines. It was like seeing an actual live animated comic book. Sting out there yelling that he's coming back stronger, faster, and madder. The only thing missing were giant messages popping up on the screen that read, "Pow!" and "Bam!" It was amazing shit. It's good to see Sting back in the picture again, though. I know it's only been like a month since he's been out. But to see him physically on camera here, it reminds you of why star power is everything in pro wrestling. So then we had Bob Cook and Zan Pansy versus the Midnight Express. God bless Bobby Eaton. You all know I've never had a bad thing to say about him. But the minute he tried to let Bob Cook and Zan Pansy get offense in on him during this match, that is the point where I deemed that the Midnights have officially lost the plot. There's selling for guys like Mike Jackson or, I don't know, Nelson Royal, George South even. Guys like that, okay. But Beautiful Bobby getting worked over by guys like Bob Cook or Zan Panzer, that is a fucking travesty. That being said, Stan was on a whole different level of motivation here. Kind of looked like he actually wanted to be on TV for a change. He was working hard. Which is not to say Stan didn't ever work hard. But let's be honest, he's had his good and bad days. Now remember the story. The Midnights are not the rightful U.S. Heavyweight Tag Champions, but they still have possession of the belts because they stole them from Pillman and Zank. I believe that Cornette fine is now approaching 5 figures now. What did they say, $200 for each day he didn't turn the belts over? Not that he cares. So the Midnights won with the double flapjack. And then immediately after the bell, guess what happened? Well, Pillman and Zank ran out from the back. They shit-canned the Midnights in about 10 seconds. And they took their belts back. That was it. After all the crap the Midnights put Pillman and Zank through a couple weeks ago, babyfaces just come out here and stole their belts back. I'm guessing that was one of those backup plans after Jim Herd scrapped a lot of the original ideas for this feud. He said, "We're not letting the Midnights keep their heat for too long." What do you think this is? Nobody wants to see the Midnights look strong. By that logic, they should have just laid out Bobby and Stan with the belts and then pissed in their mouths while they were down. That would have been the ultimate icing on the cake. Also important to remind you, in case you missed last week, they're about to run this match back on house shows multiple times over the next couple months in the lead up to Capital Combat. The payoff. Guess how many times the Midnights won in this series? You guessed it. Goose egg. Zilch. Nada. Not a fucking one. But they did, however, end up winning the belts officially at the pay-per-view. The Midnights did. You know, the one fucking match that the Midnights should have lost in the series. Genius, I know. Absolute geniuses in that booking room. And so that took us to the Steiners beating Joe Kazana and one of the Galaxy Jobbers in short order. Honestly, nothing to note here aside from Scotty wearing the world's biggest arm pad. Obviously to shield his kayfabe left arm injury that the Andersons worked over previously. Steiner spent a few minutes killing these guys, and Rick eventually gave Kazana the super belly-to-belly throw. One of the few workers I would actually voluntarily take a middle rope belly-to-belly from. Because at least I know he would execute it safely. But yeah, that's all I got for this week. Again, they said it was 2 hours. JR did at the top of the show. When I watched it, and there were definitely a handful of jump cuts. I think they also completely cut out a Ric Flair-Ricky Morton match that they were supposed to air, which kind of sucks. And that was probably a solid 8 minutes of content right there. The show was... It was a show. They got well over a month until Capital Combat, so... I mean, there is a lot of... I hate to use the term void filler, but lesser important stuff going on right now. You know, right now the big hot program is everything going on with the Midnights and the Pillman Zank stuff, which saying things are hot in that program would probably be overstating it now. But it's definitely taking top priority over a lot of the other stuff. I think they're just buying their time and waiting until Sting comes back. They know it's going to be a while. And since they already know they're not aiming to put the title on Luger in the meantime, the whole world title picture is kind of in limbo mode until the Great American Bash. It just sucks that, you know, for every Steiners or Anderson Brothers or Road Warriors segment we get, there's also Captain Mike Rotunda and Norman the Lunatic and all this other hokey ass shit going on that makes me want to gargle with rubbing alcohol. It's just WCW not knowing their intended audience, trying to be WWF in the worst way possible. And they wonder why they drove away so much of their core audience in the year 1990. Just look at the television product, man. It's not good. Even with the star power we're still seeing on a week-to-week basis. The company as a whole has completely lost the plot. They don't know where they're going or what the vision of the company is over the next 3 to 5 years. I think they're solely banking on Sting's growing popularity. That's like the only guy they're prioritizing. Unfortunately, that was not going to be enough to save things. All right. So much to get into. And let me just say this from the beginning here. I really can't stress this enough. Thank God for these Mid-South shows, man. They are such a rewarding detox from the other two programs. When I get done watching WWF Raw or even a lot of these Saturday night syndicated TBS shows, I'm drained, I'm exhausted, I'm usually pissed off because the shows are absolute garbage. And then there's Mid-South TV, and boy does it fill me with joy. It's like when your favorite relative comes over to visit for the holidays. You're like, oh, thank God. Somebody in my family I don't outright hate being around. Someone who's actually good company. I presume that's the story with most families out there, right? Or is it only with Italians? Well, in any case, Mid-South TV has become the favorite uncle of my relationship with pro wrestling. I always look forward to it because the shows are always fun to watch. Even the relatively uneventful ones. And there have definitely been a handful of those as well. Be that as it may, let's dive into this one because this episode was definitely far from uneventful. So we begin with Bill Watts and Boyd Pierce going over the card. And one thing they mentioned from the jump was that they had to postpone the TV title tournament 1 week. Although they did say that they had the brackets and the end date planned. So it wasn't really explained why the tournament was being pushed back a week. But it did get Watts on the subject of the boys refusing to sign contracts for certain matches. For example, we were also allegedly supposed to see the Rock and Roll Express wrestle the Dirty White Boys this week. But the heels decided that they didn't want to sign for the match. Same goes with Chris Adams refusing to work with Kerry von Erich, because they obviously have beef stemming from issues in World Class during this time. And this whole subject got me thinking, okay, hold on a sec. So, Grizzly Smith can draft up a contract to try to get a match signed, and you're telling me all the talents have to do is say no, and the matches don't happen as a result? You can do that? Huh. Well, then that begs the question, why would a heel champion ever sign a contract to defend his belt? Couldn't he just, by that logic, hold on to the belt forever because he refuses to work with anybody? Hold the belt hostage? Maybe that's me trying to oversimplify things again. It was a funny topic to start off the show. The idea that the talent can actively tell the matchmaker of the company, no, I don't want to work with that guy. And Grizzly Smith apparently cannot force them into working the match anyway. He has no authority. I guess it would technically fall into the hands of Watts. Grizzly wouldn't have the power to coerce talent to work with each other. So it does make sense, but it's still a funny subject. So then Jake Roberts came over for a promo, and he and Bill Watts had a fun little hostile back and forth verbal joust. First, Jake complained about not being the number one seed in the TV title tournament. Then he started talking shit about Terry Taylor, including the fact that he dropped him on a chair the other week with the most devastating move in all of wrestling. A move that Bill Watts himself coined the most dangerous move in the sport, the DDT. And so they went back and forth about the way in which Jake used the DDT on Taylor, the fact that he did it after the match ended and Terry had already beat Jake clean in the middle of the ring. And right before he left, he circled back to name-dropping Ric Flair, since Watts had brought his name up during his little tirade. And all he said is that Jake's the kind of guy that can be bought. Then he left without providing any more context. It's always fun getting to see the Cowboy interact with the boys. One of the very few promoters that, even in post-retirement stages, you shudder at the idea of somebody trying to cross Bill Watts. If we learned anything about the Cowboy in the last year, he can still throw a wicked punch. And or slap. Ask Jim Cornette about that one. So from there we went to the ring for the opening bout, Brickhouse Brown versus Jag Victory. Now, if you've been following our Mid-South review series, Brickhouse isn't a newcomer to the area. It has been a while since we've seen him on television, however. He got that big push from out of the gate when he came in and knocked off Buddy Landell 3 times in one segment. They'd given him multiple big opportunities against a lot of the top talent in the area. So we hear that Brickhouse is back. He and Josh Stroud scored a big upset win in a tag match with Dr. Death and Hercules during a tape match at the Irish McNeal Boys Club 2 weeks ago. And so now he's being given a second chance to climb through the ranks in Mid-South. The Brickhouse push was always a challenging thing to cover because we talked extensively during the series about Bill Watts' poor attempts at trying to whitewash JYD when he left in the summer of last year. All these young black athletes he had brought in to try to take over that top spot. And pretty much all of them have been utter flops. And Brickhouse, if you remember, he was among those guys that Watts was bringing in during that time. And while he was a good athlete and could do some really impressive stuff in the ring, he didn't have that JYD star power appeal. And I don't think the Midsouth fans were willing to accept Brickhouse Brown being shoehorned into that position, because I think everybody saw it for what it was. Even here, it took a while for the fans to really warm up to Brickhouse. They were respectful of him, but they weren't really behind him in the traditional babyface sense. His work was solid. Again, fantastic athlete, great body, but he just lacked the charisma that set him above all the other top babyfaces. He also wasn't a big guy, so to speak. And this was still when it was considered the land of the giants, even in the territories. So he had a lot of things working against him, and this just didn't work. But as we'll continue to see, Watts was still on a life mission to find any black athlete he could to come in and get pushed to the moon. The reality hadn't set in yet. Watts was still too stubborn. So then we came back to see the closing minutes of the Kamala-Terry Taylor match from last week. What I still maintain is the best match Kamala ever had in Mid-South. And of course, with Taylor now being the new North American champion, one of their top stories centers around Ted DiBiase trying to claim that Terry didn't officially beat him for the title, that DiBiase should still be the rightful champion. So they're doing a lot of layered stories with him right now, because in addition to DiBiase still calling him out, you've also got Jake Roberts furthering along the issues. He just got a big win over Kamala the other week, which sent him into a raging tailspin, where Kamala beat the shit out of everybody in sight afterwards, including General Akbar. So going into this episode, when we come to find out that Kamala's opponent was Shawn Michaels, I laughed. Because I'm like, what a rib on Shawn. The week after Kamala's first major singles loss in Mid-South, now he has to go out there and be served as fodder to a pissed-off Ugandan giant. As expected, Kamala killed him, laid him out before the match even officially got started. One of the greatest rev bump spots I've ever seen took place in this 2-minute angle. It was when Kamala goozled Pee Wee Anderson with one hand and launched him halfway across the ring. Looked like Kamala manhandling a small child. Admittedly, there easily was a 200-pound weight difference between the two, so I imagine it wasn't problematic for Kamala to do this to Pee Wee. But it led to a bunch of guys running out from the back to try to make the save. It eventually led to Terry coming out and blocking Akbar's attempts at running him into the ring post on the floor. Then when Friday tried to blindside Terry from behind, Terry cut him off and gave him the pile driver on the floor to lay him out. And that distracted Kamala for long enough to stop fighting, so he could go out and pick up and carry the unconscious Friday to the locker room. So we've now reached the stages of how to tame the beast with Kamala. He does in fact have feelings. He's not just a cold-hearted, animalistic wild man. fine little angle for story advancement. Didn't need to be anything special. I always enjoy seeing rookie Shawn Michaels get pummeled. So this is a win for me. And so then we shift gears to what's been going on between the Barbarian and Butch Reed. Last week there was a brawl segment where we saw Butch get into it with the Barbarian after a squash. It resulted in poor Reed having his custom suit ripped to shreds. He was very unhappy about that, as you might imagine. Although it did teach Reed a valuable lesson. Don't show up to fights in good clothing. That's the lesson. Very simple formula. Suits and street fights, not a good combination. So that led to this week where the Barbarian beat up Mike Jackson, powered him around for a couple minutes, and then submitted him with a full Nelson. Not really much else to know beyond that. I'll get to the next match in a sec, but before I address that, there was a DiBiase pre-tape where he acknowledged that he's now forced to leave Mid-South for 30 days as a result of losing a stipulation match between him and Duggan. But one thing DiBiase mentioned here is how the last time he had to leave Mid-South, it was for a full calendar year. This time it's only for 30 days. So that gives DiBiase 1 month to prepare to come back to end Duggan's career for good. He said the issues between them are like the Civil War. It may be over to some people, but in the hearts of others, it still lives on to this day. The only thing I heard in my head through that whole conversation was Dusty going, "It will never be over." But I guess the Civil War analogy was apropos too. It's actually quite on par with a lot of the crazy shit we see in today's culture. You think about it, there's always some kind of cultural civil war infighting going on, mostly amongst people in our own nation. But I'll spare you the political commentary for now. Let's talk about Chris Adams and Dr. Death versus Tom Pritchard and Terry Daniels. So again, we heard at the top of the show, Chris Adams refused to work with Kerry von Erich this week, even though they were originally booked to wrestle each other. So they put Chris in this match instead. Chris, I believe, was the Texas heavyweight champion during this time in World Class. So he had the belt around his waist at the start. Also important to remember, too, that he and Gino were right in the thick of their great heel work as a dynamic duo. So Chris was full-fledged heel here. You know, as good as a babyface as he was, I still believe Chris Adams was far superior as a heel. Like, he had so much more fire as a bad guy. And especially with that young, clean-shaven look. He always had that smug, haughty UK attitude that came along with the whole package. It worked so well. So he and Tom had some fun back and forth action at the beginning. Chris sold for a minute to let Tom get some shine before he tagged in Dr. Death so he could maim the shit out of Terry Daniels. They kind of had an idea for a finish that didn't exactly come together great in execution. Terry was supposed to leapfrog over Williams so that he could run into Chris's super kick. It was kind of a shitty looking super kick though because the timing didn't exactly hit right. And we all know Chris Adams had one hell of a super kick. One of the best deliveries of that move I've ever seen anybody do. That includes Shawn Michaels. So the finish was a tad clunky. But it showcased enough of Chris so that the people could get a general taste of what he was doing in '85. And remember, they replaced Adams in that tag match so that he didn't have to wrestle Kerry this week. So who did Kerry wrestle? Thor. Indeed, you heard that right. He wrestled Thor, in air quotes, Thor. Not Chris Helmsworth. Not the mythical Greek god of war, or whatever he was. No, this is another kind of Thor. You might also recognize him under a different name if you watched the WWF in the early 90s. And by that I primarily mean between the years 1991 and 1992, because that's how infamously short his run was there. I'll spare you the build-up. Y'all remember Nails? The ex-convict who wrestled in the orange jumpsuit? The supposed former cellmate of the Big Boss Man? Or whatever that dumbass storyline was. I don't even remember. Was it that the Boss Man was his cellmate? Or he was the prison guard who abused Nails when he was incarcerated? I don't fucking remember. It was fucking WWF in the early 90s. It was all shit back then. The point is, he was a rotten worker, and his run flopped so bad in the WWF, he barely lasted a full year before he got released because of the physical confrontation with Vince, where he purportedly tried to choke Vince out during an argument over contract disputes. And later on, he tried to sue the company for wrongful termination, claiming that Vince sexually abused him. And God, what a nut job. The guy was batshit insane. And anybody that's ever publicly talked about him, I don't think I've ever heard a single good commentary mention about him in or out of kayfabe. He was just not a good fit for the business. So with all of that in mind, going into this match, you might wonder how things turned out when Kerry von Erich had to try to get a watchable match out of him. Surprise. He did not. However, with that said, this match did not suck as bad as I thought it would. I figured, oh boy, this is going to be a train wreck and a half. It actually wound up being only moderately horrible. Maybe even passable if we use very low standards. Keeping in mind that Nails' work was utter trash, and Kerry was by no stretch an in-ring technician himself, they managed to string together a relatively okay short squash. Kerry went over with the claw. That set up the afterbirth with Jake Roberts coming out to confront Kerry. They tried to insinuate that Kerry was doing this as a favor for Ric Flair. Or I'm sorry, Jake, not Kerry. To come in and blindside Kerry since they'd obviously been feuding over the world title in World Class. And so Jake went in to cheap shot Kerry, to which Kerry then retaliated. That led to Chris Adams running in to superkick Kerry's head off. Hell of a sell job, too. And just as it looked like the heels were going to get the last laugh, after Terry Taylor came down to try to help Kerry to the back, the babyfaces hit the ring to run off the heels, including Thor, who at that point was just kind of standing around like a spare prick at the wedding. That whole deal was kind of whatever to me. Kind of shook my head at it. It was like, can you just let the heels get some fucking heat on themselves? Did you really need to have Kerry make his own comeback twice in one segment? How much overkill do you need? One would assume this is going to set up some kind of TV match with Adams and Roberts taking on Kerry and Taylor, depending on how many dates they have Kerry booked for. We'll see. And I guess Thor is the odd man out here. Again, once we got past the match, the rest of the segment was fine. Then we had the Dirty White Boys taking on Tim Horner and Brad Armstrong. Horner and Armstrong would end up becoming a pretty formidable tag team duo during their run together in the Carolinas. What do they call them? The Lightning Express? They weren't featured all that prominently. Here they were just used to get over the Dirty White Boys, who are still in line for a tag team title shot. Solid enhancement match. The heels spent a while double-teaming Horner, which caused Armstrong to hit the ring to try to break up the illegal 2-on-1. But then the heels cut off Horner again and went over with a fallaway slam. It's still hard for me to wrap my head around the fact that literally within the last month, Brad Armstrong went from North American champion to being a guy. It is such a bizarre transition. I mean, we've seen guys get bumped up and down the card periodically throughout wrestling history, but the de-escalation of Brad Armstrong is quite the sight. You know, it's like they recognize that putting the North American belt on him was a huge mistake. So now they're trying to retcon the whole thing and pretend like it never happened. Poor guy. On the scale of all-time terrible regional world champions, he wasn't that bad. He was certainly a better pick than fucking Black Bart. Remember that whole short experiment in World Class where they put the world title on him right after Chris Adams had to forfeit it? To this day, I still don't even know how Bart ended up with the belt. I think it was a straight-up phantom title switch. Then he immediately lost it to Kevin in his first title defense. Fucking wild. You know what else was wild? Me trying to figure out if the Steve Casey I watched in this next match with Paul Brown was the same Steve Casey I'm thinking of. Now, there was a Steve Casey that wrestled in WCW. You're not mistaken. Although the Steve Casey that wrestled in WCW in '89, he had long blonde hair, and he was in much better ring shape than this Steve Casey. I also don't remember him being this tall. It could not have been the same guy. I know for a fact it wasn't Steve Crusher Casey, the well-known Irish pro wrestler from the late 30s who beat Lou Thez in the AWA. Later on became a multi-time AWA world champion, I think. Yeah, he was definitely not that guy. Whoever he was, I don't know what the hell ever happened to him. It's a shame because he had an alright showcase here. The crowd seemed to get behind him at the end. It did kind of fall apart toward the finish when Casey went to backdrop Brown and Brown came down and landed hard on the side of his left knee. Looked like he really fucked himself up on the landing. So he was hobbling around for a minute before he got put away with a bow and arrow lock. I did, for the record, try to look up some other information about this Steve Casey. I could not find jack shit about him on the internet. It's like he literally only wrestled here in Midsouth and nowhere else. Total blimp on the radar in wrestling history. Very odd. Still a good show, though. A lot of information and a lot of material to take away from this one. You know, it's one of those things where go back and look at the Mid-South timeline, basically between late 83 and even up to this point where we are in 85. It's a great time to be a wrestling fan, dude. Goes back to the Dennis Condrey conversation we had earlier. This was prime peak pro wrestling. This whole mid-80s timeline. And that's not to say anything about what was happening elsewhere across the country, even internationally. Not every territory was a home run by this point. But God, think about all the wrestling that was out there during this time. All the talent that was out there. Christ. You just don't... No, I'm not going to get into it. There will never be another period like this again. That's all I'll say. It's probably on a good note to wrap it up, though. So, we will reconvene on Monday for Retro Raw. And for the time being, we'll just keep running with the regular format. I don't think I have any out-of-town commitments coming up that I know of. It's just going to get kind of busy with Easter week. I got to see how things go. Probably 2 weeks from now, there will not be a Friday show because there's going to be a period where I'm just not really going to have an evening myself. Basically from Wednesday through, well, that's Sunday. It's going to be very hectic. So we'll see. I don't make any promises on this channel. But I appreciate everybody that comes back to check out the show every week, and I'll talk to y'all soon. Thanks, everybody. Take care and peace out.